Hello, everyone. Welcome again. Today we'll be speaking to Victoria Turner, who's another of our authors from Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. So welcome, Victoria.
Hi, thank you.
So could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I've just finished my PhD at the University of Edinburgh. I've got a few corrections to do, but I'm going to start teaching in September at Ripon College, Cuddesdon, which is connected to the University of Oxford. And my PhD research was in world Christianity, and I looked at how the Iona community and the Council for World Mission both reacted to larger kind of missional theology changes and how that influenced their own context. So for the Iona community, they wanted to overcome class in Scotland, and the way they did that changed. And the Council for World Mission wanted to overcome kind of coloniality in its own partnership, moving from like a normative, structured, traditional kind of missionary society towards a partnership of churches, which is kind of what my chapter here draws upon some of that research.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations, by the way, on your PhD. So could you briefly describe what your chapter is about?
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk about the London Missionary Society. So people have like looked at it in a more critical light in some senses of how it planted churches in the non-Western world, and like the kind of obviously the history with colonialism, and also like this work with anti-slavery as well has been really important, and also class and things like this. But one thing that's kind of endured is this idea that the London Missionary Society has always been ecumenical. Because in the beginning, the London Missionary Society was ecumenical, that when they were like planting churches in the non-Western world, it was this idea of, well, we don't want to plant any sort of one church government. It was going to be up to the indigenous people to decide for themselves what their local church would look like, which was pretty forward in 1795. That was big, you know, to give leadership to indigenous people, that the missionaries didn't want to come in and just like lead everything. But research has shown that in practice, like that didn't really work. We know that when like white missionaries went over with all of their education and their theology, that they didn't really like leave it up to indigenous people to decide exactly how they wanted their church to look. And also there's been some analysis that this model is actually congregationalist in its structure. So the idea that individual churches, like the individual church having like the biggest hierarchy of leadership, is congregational in tradition. And the vast majority of involved people in the London Missionary Society in those early days were congregational. So that's like this first idea of it being ecumenical. Actually, it wasn't quite ecumenical. It was congregational, really, in polity. And all of the people that came together, they were from different denominations, but they were all really from the same network, like this evangelical network that today we could kind of think maybe mirrors kind of something like the Student Christian Movement or the Evangelical Alliance. Like it was a network like that. So these people all knew each other. So again, in what sense, like when we're thinking of diversity as we understand the ecumenical movement today, was that ecumenical? And then finally, it didn't mirror like this idea. So if we think of ecumenism as like bringing churches together in church unions, it didn't want to do that. So the whole kind of branch that it came from, so the evangelical revival movement, just wanted to kind of reimburse kind of Christianity in everyone. It didn't want to kind of change that there were different churches or different structures, but kind of the same as the way Edinburgh 1910, the missionary conference, didn't want to talk about unions because that would have upset the Anglo-Catholics. This just saw division as something annoying, so we're just going to pretend like they don't exist. We don't actually want to invest in those boring conversations to fix them, but we're just going to kind of do our own thing over here. So kind of was my first issue with the idea of ecumenical, and then kind of the London Missionary Society changed and it did become congregational, and this is when the Congregational Union became a church, and that was pretty important for allowing the Missionary Society to change. So this is when the name changed to the Congregational Council for World Mission. But with this change, only the Western churches were like in charge. So instead of like a voluntary society where it was individuals who were in charge of the mission, it became it became a congregation. So the churches that were in charge of the mission, which is in a way was better for the majority of all churches, because they were talking to a church, not to like some individuals who were very dedicated to mission. So there was a better pipeline. But at the same time, the majority of all churches weren't allowed to direct their own mission. They weren't allowed to say, this is our priorities, or like, it was still from London to them. And then the final stage was after 2 conferences that happened with the Council for Mission, where they brought together churches from the majority world and from the global north, kind of in a reaction to theology coming from like the World Council of Churches, which CWM leadership at that time thought was a bit too radical. It doesn't really apply to us. We're not colonial. We're a good missionary society. So I think they kind of did these conferences to kind of put it to bed and kind of say like, okay, all of that stuff over there, that doesn't apply to us, right? And they kind of got into this space, and the majority of all churches were like, no, it does. This is not good either. So it was a bit of a shock. And it was quite a personal journey for a lot of the CWM staff, and they realized that they completely had to change their model. So it went from a partnership of churches from just the Western churches to a fully global partnership of churches, which included like unions like the Church of South India, which had Anglican episcopacy in it and things like this, which they thought would be a big problem, but was accepted. And it's really interesting that when the United Reformed Church was created in 1972, created a really big change. So the Presbyterian Board of Missions came on board, and it had to change their name and take congregational out of the name. But then already, like in 1947, I think the Church of South India came on board and had like Anglican episcopacy, and nothing happened. It was like, oh, well, that's going to be tricky. I don't know how we're going to relate to all of the different missionary societies involved in that. But not the kind of same change happened as when this British Union changed. So I guess my chapter is kind of wondering, like, if we're calling all of these different models ecumenical, what's ecumenical, and like which one is good? And they're not the same, so how are they the same thing? And in conclusion, I'm believing that it's easier for British churches and white people to say that it's ecumenical. It like makes us feel good. I think especially in the United Reformed Church, where we are an ecumenical church, kind of looking at this legacy and saying, well, they always had the best intentions because they were ecumenical. Actually, that kind of dissolves kind of a lot of responsibility. Whereas if we go back and we're quite critical and we're saying, well, if ecumenical means church union, but you're ignoring the global south, how is that ecumenical? Or if church union means ecumenical, but really we're just transplanting one kind of ecclesiology, then that's not really ecumenical.
So what made you take this approach to writing your chapter?
I think it was just that maybe it's an angle that hasn't really been explored so much before. And it's definitely in my own interest to think about the relationship between mission and ecumenism. Because I think mission and how we do mission needs to be involved in partnership and how we relate to one another. And that obviously really seamlessly connects with the ecumenical movement. And of course, the ecumenical movement wouldn't exist without the missionary movement and all of these kind of interconnections. And I feel today in British kind of ecumenism, we kind of see mission as like a scapegoat and kind of think, oh, we have all of these divisions, but we're doing this mission together and therefore it's good. But often I kind of feel like the mission that's actually done by different churches is so different that this also needs some kind of analysis. So I think I just kind of want to help complicate this relationship between ecumenism and mission, and that it's not seamless, and that these words mean different things to different people, and they also mean different things at different times.
Okay, thank you. So what would you say has shaped your social conscience?
So I didn't really grow up in a very like social conscious family. Like it was just like a more normal family, like very British. You didn't really talk about these kind of big themes. And I guess maybe going to like woke me up a little bit. But actually I think it was COVID really. I think my internet went then, my bad. So during COVID, I started reading a lot more about like racism and a lot more like liberation theology from when I was starting my PhD and my master's in world Christianity, and kind of realizing like, why is it that this majority world theology never made it to my local church where I grew up in Cardiff, and why sometimes it almost feel like tagged on in the more progressive churches. So and then these things kind of came together, and I kind of got woken up to how unjust the world was. And like also the complicated history of churches sometimes doing well and trying to be on the side of social justice, and other times being very complacent and like basking in its own privileged position in society. And I became, maybe I'd say, obsessed with like researching this and thinking about this as part of my own journey and how it shaped me. And it was around this time as well I realized like my own class consciousness like wasn't existent, whereas I grew up working class and I kind of been fighting and fighting to catch up, and I didn't kind of comprehend that maybe there was like a system that was rigged against me. And when I kind of realized that clicked, and I understood racial justice and I understood LGBTQ awareness and needs and all of these other things kind of slotted into place, and the idea of solidarity became a lot more important.
Thank you. What do you think are the biggest challenges to the church and wider society in terms of social conscience?
That was a really hard question you gave us there, Carol.
Yeah.
I think thinking about this a lot, actually, and I think there are some things that the church is good at talking about, or my church anyway. So I guess my church is in a weird position that we hold together a diversity of theologies, but we're seen as a very progressive church. So we quite comfortably talk about LGBTQ inclusion. Our last General Assembly passed a resolution accepting and loving and wanting to help trans people. We have trans ministers, you know, all of this kind of stuff. We fight it against the anti-boycott bill, like, you know, refugees and things like this, and Ukraine. The normal things I think we can talk about, but when it gets to the bigger issues of structural injustice, things like capitalism and how like the economy works and how it's biased against different countries, about like topics like Palestine, which is so controversial with like Christian Zionism and trying to support Israel and not wanting to be anti-Semitic and board of deputies and all of these things. I think the church can often be quite uncomfortable, and it almost raising these larger issues is very unpopular. Like legacies of slavery, for instance, the idea of like our own guilt. We've not kind of come to terms with that. So I think a really good analogy for this is like the ideas of like pinkwashing or homo nationalism, when kind of there's still this colonial model of, well, we in Britain, like we accept LGBTQ people and other countries around the world don't. And there's still this like superiority complex. Whereas if you ask LGBTQ people in the UK, what's it like to live here? It's not great, but kind of our media is talking about how we are so ahead of the game and all of these kind of things, when actually like we're still pillaging resources from the global south. There's still this capitalist inequality. There's so many more complications, but I think surface level things and things that we're comfortable with, the church is quite happy to talk about, but getting deeper into like capitalism and how we're investing in this capitalist structure and how the church is surviving and thriving from this system, we don't really want to talk about that very much.
Thank you. So finally, what do you hope people will take from reading your chapter?
I hope so there's a lot of literature about the ecumenical winter and how kind of ecumenism is static and young people aren't being involved and there's no energy or movement. And I think I was quite struck by the last Faith and Order kind of working paper. So they tried to get responses, this is part of the World Council of Churches, they tried to get responses from around the world, and no churches from Africa or Latin America gave any response. And if we think about the movement of world Christianity, it's Africa and Latin America where it's greatest. So that makes absolutely no sense. So and I was just really struck, and you know, they were like, that's a problem, we should work on that. And I was like, that's a travesty. We're talking about, you know, the movement of the ecumenical movement and how it's brought in churches from around the world and it's unifying. Like, if people aren't engaged in the processes, I think that's because the processes are still corrupt. They're still in this Western model of like ecclesiastical union, and they're done in a way that churches from around the world aren't able, or of course they're able, but they're not seeing it as a priority. So I guess I'm questioning like who's setting the agenda in the ecumenical movement and who sets these definitions. So I think I just wanted to kind of push us a little bit to rethink how we define things and think about maybe how we can unlearn and unmake the ecumenical movement and remake it in a way that it's purposeful and meaningful for all of the churches around the world. And then surely that's better corresponding to Jesus's claim that we all might be one. We can't all just be one on British terms, which is, you know, the ground from which it swelled, but we have to all be one on an ecumenical ground and an okumene in this kind of way. And relate both structural unity to lived unity and justice, and how all of these things interrelate, I think, need to come into every single part. Yeah, so I guess that was the point I was trying to make.
Thank you, Victoria. Well, thanks for sharing with us today. Thanks for taking the time to speak about your work. And I hope people will have a look at your chapter to get the full picture. And thanks for taking time out today.
Thank you.